Alara's fingers were still beneath the edge of King Kalen's ceremonial collar when she saw Beta Garrick step into the preparation chamber. The silver-threaded fabric at Kalen's throat had twisted under the weight of his formal cloak, and she had been ordered to straighten it before the treaty procession began. Garrick stopped 2 paces away and said, "The carriage is ready, Your Majesty." Alara barely heard the words. Her attention had caught on the left side of his coat. The wool hung smoothly everywhere except beneath his ribs, where one narrow ridge pulled the fabric inward and forced the hem to fall unevenly. Most people would have blamed the cut of the coat. Alara knew better. She had spent years holding leather flat, while her father stitched weapon harnesses for hunters who could not afford palace craftsmen. A concealed sheath changed the tension of a coat in a particular way. A spring-blade harness changed it even more. Garrick shifted his weight. The ridge moved with him. There was metal under that coat. Worse, the fresh leather strap, showing for half a heartbeat near his belt, sat at the exact angle required for a seated draw. Alara's hands went cold. No armed officer was permitted inside the king's carriage perimeter during a treaty procession. The rule existed precisely because ceremony compressed too many powerful men into too little space. Garrick knew that rule better than anyone. Outside, the first departure bell rang across the courtyard. Kalen turned slightly beneath Alara's hands. "Is it straight?" he asked. She looked past his shoulder. Garrick was watching the open doorway that led to the carriage yard, not the king. Alara's pulse kicked hard. If she accused the beta aloud and was wrong, she could lose more than her position. If she said nothing and was right, Kalen would be inside that carriage within minutes. She smoothed the last fold of his collar, leaned close enough that anyone watching would think she was checking the clasp, and whispered, "Your beta is armed. Don't enter the carriage." Kalen did not flinch. He did not look at Garrick. For one terrible second, Alara wondered whether he had heard her at all. Then he lifted a hand to the collar she had just fixed. "This clasp is wrong," he said calmly. "Change it before we leave." Garrick frowned. "The delegation is already waiting. Then they can wait another minute." Kalen's voice stayed even, but his eyes met Alara's in the mirror. Not belief. Not yet. Attention. She lowered her gaze and pretended to examine the clasp while the second bell began to toll outside. Garrick said nothing. He only turned his head toward the carriage again. This time, Alara saw the movement clearly. And this time, she was certain of one thing. Whatever Garrick was hiding beneath his coat, the carriage mattered to him. Kalen waited until Garrick had stepped back toward the courtyard before he spoke again. "Leave us." The attendants nearest the chamber door obeyed without question. Alara kept her hands on the collar clasp until the last footsteps faded, then lowered them. Kalen turned to face her. "Tell me exactly what you saw." There was no accusation in his voice, but there was no trust in it either. Alara forced herself to separate what she knew from what she feared. His coat pulls inward beneath the left ribs. The weight is narrow and rigid. There's fresh harness leather near his belt, angled forward. And that means a concealed weapon. Most likely a spring blade. Most likely. I can identify the harness. I can't identify his intention. Something changed in Kalen's expression at that answer. "How?" "My father worked leather. Hunters brought him harnesses, sheaths, damaged straps. I helped him from the time I could hold an awl." Kalen glanced toward the door. A royal guard stood beyond it with his back to them. That guard. What is he carrying? Alara could see only the man's formal coat and the lower edge of his belt. She studied the way the cloth rested across his right hip. Standard side sheath. Broad strap, fixed high so it won't swing while he walks. Nothing concealed. Kalen called the guard inside and ordered him to open his coat. The harness underneath matched her description. After dismissing him, Kalen looked at Alara differently. "You understand what you're suggesting. I understand what I saw. Garrick has stood beside me. Through challenges, border raids, and 3 treaty winters. If I accuse my beta of entering a royal procession armed and cannot prove why, every delegate waiting outside will know my command is divided." Alara swallowed. "Then don't accuse him yet. And if you're wrong?" She knew what he was asking. A maid interfering with royal security could not hide behind good intentions. "Then I accept the consequence." The words tasted colder than she expected. Palace service meant wages, food, and sanctuary. Losing it would leave her with none of the 3. Kalen studied her for another moment. "You are certain about the weapon?" "Yes, but not about the man carrying it." Alara hesitated, then forced herself to answer truthfully. No, the second departure bell had finished. Beyond the windows, carriage horses stamped against the stones while officials called positions. Kaelin crossed to the door. The procession remains delayed. No announcement. No accusation. He looked back at her. And you stay away from Garrick. Elara nodded. Kaelin left first. She waited several breaths before following into the outer passage. Garrick was already crossing the courtyard. He did not head toward the guards, the treaty officials, or the king. He went directly toward the royal carriage. Elara stopped beneath the archway. Kaelin's order was still clear in her mind. So was the strange pull of Garrick's coat. She watched him glance once over his shoulder before disappearing along the far side of the carriage. Elara knew she should remain where she was. Instead, keeping the stone columns between herself and the courtyard guards, she followed him. Elara kept far enough behind Garrick that the horses and courtyard traffic hid the sound of her steps. The royal carriage stood beneath the covered departure arch, black lacquer polished for the treaty procession, its silver fittings catching the pale morning light. Garrick moved along its far side and disappeared from view. Elara slipped behind a stone pillar and waited. When she looked again, he was crouched beside the passenger compartment. One hand braced against the carriage frame. The other reached beneath it. Her stomach tightened. He was not inspecting the horses or speaking to the driver. He was touching something directly below the place where Kaelin would sit. Garrick withdrew his hand, looked toward the courtyard entrance, then rose and walked away without calling a guard. The concealed weight beneath his coat was still there. Elara waited until he vanished beneath the opposite arch before moving. Kaelin had ordered her to stay away from Garrick. She told herself she was obeying the words, if not their intent. She did not cross the marked boundary around the carriage. Instead, she crouched beside the outer step where Garrick had been and studied what she could reach from outside it. At first she saw only polished wood, iron brackets, and leather straps darkened by years of oil. Then one strap caught her attention. It was too clean. The surrounding leather had softened with age, its edges rounded by weather and use. This piece was stiff, recently cut, and darker where fresh oil had been worked into it. Elara touched the exposed edge with one fingertip. New leather. Not proof of a weapon. Not proof of Garrick. But another thing that did not belong. What are you doing? Elara straightened so quickly that her shoulders struck the carriage step. A royal guard was approaching from the archway. His eyes moved from her to the carriage. No servants inside the security perimeter. I'm not inside it. You're handling the king's carriage. Elara opened her mouth, then stopped. She could not explain Garrick's weapon without exposing Kaelin's private inquiry. The guard reached for her arm. She is there on my authority. Kaelin's voice cut across the courtyard. The guard released her immediately and bowed. Several nearby officials turned toward them. Kaelin gave Elara only a brief look before addressing the guard. Return to your position. The command ended the confrontation, but not the attention it had drawn. Elara understood what Kaelin had just spent for her, a small piece of his authority, offered without explanation while foreign delegates waited. She stepped away from the carriage as he approached. You were told to stay away from Garrick. I did. His expression suggested he recognized. The technicality. What did you find? Elara glanced toward the carriage door. A dark red wax seal joined the door fastening to the frame, stamped with the royal security mark. From several feet away, it looked untouched. Up close, one edge was slightly thicker. She leaned nearer without touching it. Two impressions overlapped along the lower curve, almost perfectly aligned. Someone had broken the seal, softened or replaced the wax, and pressed the mark again. That, she whispered. Kaelin followed her gaze. Elara felt the cold certainty settle deeper. Garrick had approached a carriage that someone had opened after it was officially secured, and whatever he had reached for beneath it, he had told no one. Kaelin did not touch the seal. Come with me. He led Elara away from the carriage, stopping beneath the covered arch where their voices would not carry across the courtyard. Garrick remained nowhere in sight. Tell me what that proves. Elara looked back at the dark red wax. Someone opened the carriage after it was secured. Someone, Kaelin repeated. She heard the warning in the word. Garrick was beneath it moments ago. He is carrying a weapon he should not have. Now the seal has been replaced. Those facts make him suspicious. They do not make him guilty. You trust him? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Elara felt frustration rise before she could stop it. Enough to enter that carriage? Kalen's jaw tightened. Enough not to condemn him, because 3 things frighten you when placed beside one another. They should frighten you too. They do. That silenced her. Kalen looked toward the waiting officials. Which is why we need proof before loyalty becomes either blindness or betrayal. A procession officer approached, reminding Kalen in a low voice that the visiting delegation had already assembled and another delay would be noticed. Kalen dismissed him with an assurance that departure would follow shortly. The pressure was becoming visible now. Alara could feel eyes turning toward the arch. I need to inspect the carriage more closely, she said. You need to stop deciding what Garrick intends before you know. And you need to stop deciding he cannot intend it because you know him. Their eyes met. Neither yielded. Finally Kalen said, 5 minutes. Touch nothing you cannot explain afterward. Alara returned to the carriage, keeping her movements controlled despite the urgency pounding behind her ribs. The new strap beneath the step remained where she had found it. She lowered herself beside the frame, searching for anything that might explain why Garrick had reached underneath. A shadow fell across her hands. You were told to stay away from me. Garrick stood between her and the open courtyard. Alara rose slowly. His coat had shifted. Beneath its edge, she could finally see the dark leather harness and the metal grip nested against his ribs. Garrick followed her gaze. His hand moved toward the coat. Alara's breath caught. Who sent you here? He asked. No one. Then why are you examining the king's carriage? He stepped closer, blocking the easiest path around him. Alara glanced toward the courtyard, calculating whether Kalen could see them. Garrick opened his coat just enough to expose the spring blade she had identified. Answer me. Why are you armed? She countered. His expression changed, not guilt, but recognition. His gaze flicked past her to the carriage door. What else did you notice? Alara said nothing. Garrick looked at the wax fastening. The seal? The question struck harder than a threat. Alara stared at him. Garrick lowered his voice. Did you notice the seal too? He let the coat fall closed. I found an irregularity in the procession preparations before dawn. Only a handful of officers knew the final inspection schedule. I reported nothing because if the schedule was compromised, I didn't know which of them I could trust. Alara looked at the hidden weapon. So you armed yourself. Against whoever made a move when the king departed. And underneath the carriage? I was looking for what they changed. Alara felt her certainty fracture. Garrick had concealed a weapon. He had approached the carriage secretly. He had reached beneath Kalen's seat. Every observation remained true. The conclusion she had built from them did not. You thought it was me, Garrick said. Alara did not deny it. Footsteps approached behind them. Kalen stopped at the edge of the carriage perimeter, his attention moving from Alara to Garrick. Alara turned toward him. He knows about the seal. Garrick's face hardened. And she knows I'm armed. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Alara looked at the carriage between them. The question was no longer whether Garrick intended to kill his king. Someone had opened a vehicle that should have remained sealed, and the king was expected to sit inside it within minutes. We've been watching the wrong man, Alara said. We need to find out what they did to the carriage. Then we inspect it together, Kalen said. He kept the carriage where it stood and ordered the nearby guards to hold the departure line without explanation. Garrick took the security side, checking the frame, locks, and places an attacker with palace access might have reached. Alara ignored the polished wood and silver fittings. If someone had expected trained guards to inspect the carriage, the dangerous change would be something they were accustomed to seeing. She climbed into the passenger compartment only after Kalen gave permission. The royal seat faced forward beneath a dark leather backrest, immaculate enough to look untouched. Alara pressed 2 fingers against its edge. The leather resisted differently on the left side. She moved her hand across the seat. This has been restretched. Garrick leaned through the doorway. Repaired. Not like this. She pointed to a row of nearly invisible stitches beneath the cushion edge. The work is good. That's why it looks normal. But upholstery should distribute tension. These stitches are pulling it toward one point. Kalen remained outside the carriage. Toward what? Alara followed the tension beneath the seat until her fingers found a rigid line hidden behind the leather. Garrick crouched and looked underneath from the opposite side. There's a linkage here. Alara's pulse quickened. A narrow mechanical piece ran from beneath the seat toward the carriage frame, concealed by the newer strap she had noticed earlier. If someone sits here, she said, their weight could pull the leather down and release it. Garrick's eyes went to Kaelin. A blade. Maybe. Alara hated the uncertainty, but she would not repeat her earlier mistake by turning an inference into fact. Kaelin picked up a weighted dispatch case from beside the departure arch and handed it to Garrick. Under Alara's direction, they placed it carefully on the center of the seat while all three remained clear of the suspected linkage. The leather sank. Nothing happened. Alara stared at it. She pressed along the edge again, tracing the tension with her fingertips. I was wrong. Garrick looked beneath the carriage. About the device? About the trigger. Weight isn't enough. The hidden connection still existed. That mattered. Someone had altered the seat for a purpose that ordinary inspection would not reveal, but she did not yet understand how it worked. Kaelin glanced toward the courtyard, where impatient voices were becoming harder to ignore. What else changed after the carriage was sealed? Garrick went still. The wheel adjustment. Alara looked at him. What adjustment? A maintenance order came after final inspection. One wheel was reported to be pulling unevenly. The carriage was released for a last-minute correction, then returned here. After the seal was placed? Kaelin asked. It should have been supervised. Garrick's expression hardened. But if that seal was replaced, someone created an access window. A procession officer hurried toward them. Your Majesty, the delegation has asked whether there is a problem. We must depart now if we intend to reach the treaty grounds on schedule. Kaelin did not answer immediately. He looked into the carriage, then at Alara. Earlier, he had told her what she was permitted to do. Now he asked, what do you need? Alara looked from the altered leather to the concealed linkage disappearing toward the carriage frame. Weight had failed. The seat was only one part of the mechanism. I need to know what makes this carriage behave differently when it moves. Then we move it empty, Alara said. Before Kaelin could answer, hurried footsteps crossed the courtyard behind them. Two royal guards approached with the procession officer, whose face had lost its earlier impatience. Your Majesty. He bowed stiffly. Security has found something that requires your attention. One guard held a narrow leather working all wrapped in cloth beside a short strip of dark, freshly cut leather. Alara recognized both. They all came from the palace workroom where servants repaired straps, gloves, and tack. The leather was the same kind she had used there that morning. Where? Garrick asked. Among the materials assigned to her workstation. The guard looked directly at Alara, and she was seen handling the royal carriage after it had been secured. The accusation settled across the courtyard with frightening simplicity. Alara had touched the new strap. She had examined the seal. She had climbed inside the carriage. Every action that had brought them closer to the truth could now be arranged into a different story. That leather doesn't prove I altered anything, she said. Neither does the awl. But you had the tools, the officer replied. And access. She had access because I allowed it, Kaelin said. After the carriage was already compromised, the officer answered carefully. We cannot know when the alteration began. One guard stepped forward. Until we do, she should be detained. Garrick's jaw tightened. Alara saw the trap immediately. If he defended her by revealing his own secret investigation, he would have to explain why the king's beta had violated procession law and concealed a weapon while withholding a suspected security breach. Whoever had planted the materials had not merely chosen Alara as a convenient suspect. They had chosen the moment when every person capable of supporting her had something to lose. Kaelin looked at her. Earlier, she had feared his loyalty to Garrick would make him blind. Now the easier choice was to let the machinery of his own security decide she was guilty. Did you place either of those materials in the carriage? He asked. No, can you prove it? Alara looked toward the royal seat. Not by standing here. The guard reached for her again. Wait. Alara's voice came sharper than she intended. Everyone stopped. She looked at Kaelin. We already tested weight. It did. Nothing. The hidden linkage runs toward the frame, and the carriage had a wheel adjustment after inspection. If the mechanism depends on movement, we won't understand it while the carriage stays here. Garrick understood first. You want to roll it. Empty. Alara nodded. No driver inside. No king. No one near the seat. Move it only to the outer inspection position and watch what changes. The procession officer stared at her. That would stop the departure entirely. For now, she said. And if nothing happens, then you'll have another reason to believe I'm responsible. The words hurt because they were true. Alara could protect herself by saying no more, letting them dismantle the carriage slowly while she argued over tools and witnesses. But if the device required motion, delay might also give whoever built it time to remove the one thing that could prove what they had done. She met Kalen's eyes. Move it empty. The courtyard seemed to hold still around him. Then Kalen turned to the guards. Clear the outer inspection lane. The carriage moves without passengers. The procession officer went pale. Your Majesty, the delegation, will wait. This time the words were not an excuse over a collar clasp. They were a public order, impossible to hide from the officials already watching. Kalen looked back at Alara. Show us what we're looking for. The guards cleared the inspection lane while the carriage horses were led forward from the side, keeping the driver's bench empty. Alara stood beside Kalen and Garrick at a safe distance, her attention fixed on the royal seat visible through the open door. The carriage began to roll. One wheel turned, then another. Nothing happened. The altered leather remained still. Behind them, the procession officer shifted impatiently. Alara heard a guard murmur something about wasting time. The carriage moved farther down the stone lane. Still nothing. Her certainty began to thin. If she had misunderstood the linkage again, Kalen had halted a royal procession while evidence pointing toward her sat in a guard's hands. Garrick glanced at her. Anything? Not yet. The carriage reached the end of the straight lane where the horses were guided into the turn toward the outer inspection position. The left wheel climbed over the raised edge between paving stones. The frame tilted. Alara saw the seat change. Stop. Her voice cracked across the courtyard. The horses were halted. Alara pointed through the open door. The leather along the left side of the seat had drawn tight. The stitching she had traced earlier was no longer merely holding the upholstery in place. It was carrying tension. The movement loads it, she said. Garrick crouched at the frame without touching the mechanism. Alara followed the line with her eyes from the wheel assembly to the new leather strap and then beneath the seat. The wheel correction wasn't separate from this. When the carriage turns under road pressure, the frame pulls the linkage. That tensions the leather. Kalen looked toward the empty seat. And my weight completes it. The realization made her stomach turn. The device had been designed to survive inspection because an empty carriage could be opened, searched, and even weighted without activating it. Only the combination of a passenger and movement would finish the trigger. Garrick examined the concealed line. There's a release farther inside. Don't trip it, Alara warned. We need it intact. She looked at Kalen. The person doesn't have to carry the weapon into the carriage. The carriage is the weapon. Garrick rose slowly. His expression had gone cold. The maintenance authorization. He turned toward the guards. Secure the record. No one removes or alters it. One of them hurried toward the security station. Moments later, a shout came from beneath the departure arch. A royal security officer was moving toward the records room ahead of the guard, ignoring an order to stop. Garrick reacted immediately. Keep the carriage here. He went after him with two guards. Alara instinctively took a step forward, but Garrick looked back. Stay with the king. You need someone who can show what was changed. You've already been framed once. Which means whoever did it knows what I found. Alara looked at the tensioned seat. If that mechanism is disturbed before witnesses understand it, we lose the proof. Kalen's gaze settled on her. There was no hesitation in it now. Then you stay with the evidence. Not behind him. Not removed to safety. With the evidence. Alara returned to the carriage perimeter and watched the guards close around it. The altered seal, the new leather, the hidden linkage, and the maintenance record were no longer separate irregularities. They formed one chain. Somewhere beyond the arch, Garrick was pursuing the person who had access to every link. And for the first time since she had whispered at Kalen's collar, Alara knew exactly what had been meant to kill him. The shout beneath the arch ended in the scrape of boots and a sharp command from Garrick. A moment later, two guards brought the royal security officer back into the courtyard with Garrick behind them. The officer's face was controlled, but his eyes went immediately to the carriage. What is this? He demanded. Garrick held up the maintenance authorization. A record you were attempting to reach after I ordered it secured. Because the king's procession has been stopped over a servant's accusation. His gaze found Alara, a servant who was discovered with the tools used to alter royal property. Several officials had gathered near the departure arch now. Beyond them waited the treaty delegation, close enough that the disruption could no longer be disguised. The officer gestured toward the carriage. She handled the seal. She entered the compartment. Anything she claims to find now could have been placed there by her. Alara felt the argument land exactly where it had been designed to. Private evidence could still become one person's word against another's. Garrick could produce the maintenance record, but the officer could challenge who had written or altered it. Alara could describe the mechanism, but he could say she knew it because she built it. Kaelin looked from the waiting delegation to the carriage. Then we will not settle this privately. The officer stiffened. Your Majesty? Kaelin stepped into the open courtyard. The procession is suspended. The carriage will be examined here, before witnesses. A murmur moved through the officials. The political cost was immediate and visible. Kaelin did not retreat from it. He turned to Alara. Show them. No senior guard replaced her. No craftsman was summoned to repeat her conclusions with a more acceptable rank. Alara approached the carriage herself. The original security seal was removed and replaced, she said, indicating the doubled wax impression without touching it. The seat leather was then restretched toward this concealed linkage. The maintenance authorization created access after the official inspection. She pointed beneath the frame. Weight alone does not release it. Movement tensions the mechanism. A passenger completes the trigger. The security officer gave a short, contemptuous laugh. Convenient. Alara looked at Kaelin. We can prove it. Under her instructions, the guards preserved the visible linkage while securing a weighted case on the royal seat. No person entered the compartment. The horses were led forward again. The carriage rolled straight without reaction. Then it entered the same turn. Leather tightened. The hidden line snapped taut. This time, the weight on the seat completed what Kaelin's body had been meant to complete. A concealed metal assembly discharged through the passenger compartment with a violent crack, tearing across the space where the king's torso would have been. Silence followed. No argument survived it. Garrick handed the maintenance authorization to another guard and ordered the security officer detained pending formal judgment. The man tried to pull free, but the guards closed around him. Kaelin never looked away from the ruined royal seat. Then his gaze shifted to Alara. Around them stood officers who had wanted her detained, officials who had questioned the delay, and foreign delegates who had just watched the king expose a failure inside his own security rather than conceal it. Alara understood what his decision had cost. He had stopped his procession publicly, placed his authority behind the judgment of an Omega Maid already framed as a suspect, and allowed the evidence to decide whether that trust had been deserved. Kaelin stepped toward her. You told me not to enter the carriage. Alara glanced at the metal, buried where he should have been sitting. Yes. I'm glad I listened. By the time the damaged carriage was removed from the courtyard, the procession had become secondary to the evidence it had exposed. The detained security officer was placed under formal guard to face judgment under pack law, while the altered seal, maintenance authorization, leather linkage, and discharged mechanism were secured together. Alara's workroom materials no longer proved sabotage. They proved how carefully someone had tried to place the sabotage on her. Garrick found her near the departure arch after the courtyard had begun to clear. For once, he wore no concealed weapon beneath his coat. I owe you an acknowledgement, he said. You noticed my harness before any of my officers did. Then you noticed what I missed on the carriage. Alara raised an eyebrow. I also thought you were planning to kill him. You corrected yourself when the evidence changed. Garrick glanced toward Kaelin. That matters more. Days later, after the compromised security chain had been placed under investigation and the royal carriage procedures rewritten, Kaelin summoned Alara. He did not offer her a title of nobility. Instead, he offered her a position inspecting leatherwork, concealed fittings, seals, and material alterations connected to royal security. Her authority would come from the skill that had saved his life, not from proximity to his throne. Alara read the appointment twice before answering. There is one condition. Kaelin almost smiled. Yours or mine? Mine. If I see something wrong, I report it. Even if you dislike what I'm saying. Even if the person I suspect is someone you trust. His expression sobered. Especially then. She accepted. Some time later, a repaired carriage waited beneath the same departure arch. Alara stood beside Kaelin while guards completed the new inspection procedure. His formal collar had folded slightly beneath his cloak. Without thinking, she reached to straighten it, then paused as the memory of that first morning returned. Kaelin noticed. He did not catch her wrist or pull her closer. He simply lowered his head, giving her the choice to finish the gesture. Alara adjusted the collar. Her fingers rested briefly against the clasp. Better, he asked. She looked past him toward the carriage. Its seal was clean. Its leather lay evenly. The guards had completed every inspection under the new rules, but Kaelin did not tell her that should be enough. Instead, he followed her gaze and asked quietly, "What do you see?" Alara checked the collar once more, then looked into his eyes. There was trust there now, but no demand attached to it. She turned toward the waiting carriage, inspected it for herself, and found nothing hidden. When she came back, Kaelin was still waiting rather than assuming her answer. Alara stepped toward him because she chose to. "This time," she said, "I see a carriage you can enter."